Hi, this is Nick with 10 Bell Pod, and here's 10 facts on Paul Bearer. William Moody, aka Paul Bearer, served in the U.S. Air Force from 1972 to 76, followed by some time in the reserves. But it was while serving that he worked part-time as an EMT, which led to visits to funeral homes, which sparked an interest in mortuary science, and his legit involvement in the funeral industry. Paul was a in-ring competitor. While he did do some backyard wrestling, his official in-ring debut was June of 74 as he would start wrestling under a mask as Mr. X, the Mortician, and the Embalmer. He was also using things like caskets and urns as props way back then. While he wanted to be a wrestler, in International Championship Wrestling in Mississippi in 78, he was moved to manager and renamed Percy Pringle. Little did they know, one of the greatest pro wrestling managers of all time had just been unleashed. In December of 78, Percy married and had a son in 79. Now with a family, he cut back on wrestling to focus more on college and getting a steady job in the funeral business, so we almost never had the great Paul Bearer. Lucky for us, Moody got back into wrestling in 1985 at Championship Wrestling Florida, managing Rick Rude, Missing Link, and was Lex Luger's first ever manager in his first ever match. Rude and Pringle later moved to Texas and WCCW. There, Percy managed a very young, stunning Steve Austin, the Great Kabuki, Dingo Warrior, and in one of the craziest coincidences ever, he was the first manager for the first match for Texas Red as he got broke in by Bruiser Brody. When WCCW closed in 1990, Percy was going to just go back to the funeral industry. But when Rick Rude, who was now in WWF, heard this, he told him to hold on and eventually called him back with the phone number of Vince McMahon. December of 90, Paul met with WWF. There, Vince saw Percy's real-life mortuary experience, and in an instance of quite possibly the most perfect timing in history, Percy was hired to manage the recently debuted Undertaker. Paul's iconic screeching voice was influenced by Boris Karloff movies. Boris Karloff had this kind of high-pitched, squeaky voice, and Paul thought that would be a perfect fit for his character. While Paul is always associated with The Undertaker, you could argue there would be no Kane without him. He also played a big role in legitimizing Mick Foley to the WWF audience when Paul turned heel, betraying Undertaker at SummerSlam 96 and gave Mankind a win over the almost unbeatable Taker. During the American Badass era, Paul didn't really have room within the gimmick, so he went into more of a backstage role as an agent, a talent scout, but he didn't like that very much, so he stepped away when his contract was up in 2002. However, he'd be back in just a couple years at WrestleMania 20 when Undertaker went back to being the dead man and all was right in the world. For more pro wrestling history, find 10 Bell Pod on your favorite podcast app or find us on Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube.